Hey everybody, before we get going, a word from our sponsor this week, Digital Ship. On 15 October in Athens, senior maritime IT, digitalization, and operations leaders will come together to tackle some of the industry's biggest challenges, from scaling AI and strengthening cyber resilience to modernizing data and IT infrastructure. If you're looking for practical insights, real-world case studies, and candid discussions from the people driving change across shipping, this is the event to be at. Secure your delegate pass today at thedigitalship.com/summit. And now, on to our podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Ambersano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading the charge. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Emma Collier. Emma is the founder of Further Ventures and recently hosted a major symposium ahead of Posidonia that brought together leaders from shipping, technology, investment, and policy to discuss one of the biggest questions facing the industry today. That is, how do we move beyond the AI hype and into meaningful transformation? In this conversation, we're going to explore the lessons from that event, what Emma is seeing across the maritime innovation ecosystem, and where she believes the next opportunities are emerging. This will also serve as a nice halfway point to the year as we take our first ever break from podcasting. If you've been following along at home, I've produced a podcast at least every other week for the past 4+ years. You won't hear from me again until September, but we're going to come back tan, rested, and ready, and hopefully have some exciting guests. Emma, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. This has been a long time coming, so I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. And of course, for those that didn't know, Emma had a podcast on and off here for the last year, and I was a guest, and that was pretty exciting and part of the reason why we thought it would be great to link up on The Last Dinosaur. So before we get going, I'd love to ask, how did you get into maritime? And especially, how did you get into maritime in Greece? Because that's where you are, which I think is fascinating.
So I am originally from the U.S., mostly based in San Francisco, but I've been in Greece now for about almost 10 years and in shipping for about 5. So interestingly, Greece has always been on the horizon for me since I was a kid, though I don't have any roots here. I have this a memory of my grandparents giving me a book of mythology and having this immediate strange sense of deja vu, this feeling that I was born in the wrong place and I needed to get there as soon as I could. And the feeling never faded. So eventually I just decided to trust it. And maritime has actually turned out to be a big part of it, which isn't something I could have expected. As like many others, my entry was this lovely, addictive accident. So I was brought in to consult on a new brand whose concept was to tokenize the first maritime asset, an LNG carrier. And they wanted somebody from outside of maritime who could look at the idea without inherited assumptions. So for me, I was attracted to the benefits. They were really interesting, like more precise exposures, fewer intermediaries, access to deal flow that you wouldn't normally see. And I could get that it would be attractive to both younger investors, digitally native, and also for the more traditional side if positioned correctly. One thing that was important was to kind of put the terminology like distributed ledger technology and tokenization to infrastructure mechanics rather than headlines. And this ended up evolving into a full-time role helping to build Evident, which many of you may know is George Economou's tech startup where I led global partnerships. And Evident ultimately expanded into other verticals, renewable energy and art, but I was quietly hooked on what it could offer maritime if executed properly at scale. And I think what I love most about it was translating technology into the right framing, right? Like finding a recognizable story for the people that it could benefit who might overlook it otherwise. And this is what I've been doing more or less in maritime ever since.
That's a real interesting way in because, especially in Greece, but around the world, of course, you have a lot of people who have family history within the shipping world. So for you to come in kind of on the outside is, I think, fascinating, and certainly bringing it a little bit to full circle on what you're doing with your not startup, but with your company today. Talk about what you're doing and really about your pivot into a think tank, which I think is kind of interesting because we don't necessarily have a lot of that, especially when it comes to the digitalization or transformation in our industry. There are think tanks, but in maritime, but they're more associated with things like defense and that part of the maritime industry. So, with further, talk a little bit about how you came to what you're doing now and the path that you're on.
So when I first started out into maritime, I was hungry to learn how the industry thought through things, how different segments were handling digitalization. And so, I did what most people do, and I started going to a lot of conferences. And what I learned pretty quickly was the model doesn't allow for much of a participatory exchange between attendees and panelists. And a lot of times Q&As get cut entirely. And I know this is due to time constraints and other factors, but I think what ends up happening is that we lose a lot of value, which is where you learn the most in these moments where something's not orchestrated, but it unfolds in the moment based on what happens to come up. So I have a background in corporate events, actually, from the bespoke to grandiose and everything in between. One thing I've always carried forward is that when you change a format, you can change the spectrum of outcomes. And this includes how engaged an audience is and what they hold on to. I realized what I was after was something that was more like a symposium so that I could challenge and evolve my own perspectives as part of the conversation. As time went on, after enough people asked me where they could go to learn about AI and digitalization, kind of in this sort of format, because apparently I wasn't the only one, I had nothing to suggest. I thought, all right, let's create one. Further Ventures is an unscripted, unfiltered, and uncensored think tank style initiative for maritime leadership to engage with AI and digitalization that's much closer to an intellectual cage fight than a normal panel. And this exchange is entrepreneur to entrepreneur because that's what we all are. I think many of us still haven't had our caveman meets fire moment when it comes to AI, this one that leaves you awestruck and ends your argument against its potential. And we have to remember that first meeting with fire also came with singed eyebrows and burnt villages and so on. And it took us a while to get from burning things down to cooking with it. We're back in this experimentation mode we've always been in as a species. And so the point of the sessions is to stress test your experimental thinking before you trust it to shape a decision that has real consequences.
From what I recall reading and what we talked about is in your first symposium right ahead of Posidonia. Firstly, how was that received? And do you think you started to close some of that gap, as you put it, between playing with fire and getting your eyebrows singed and understanding the capabilities? So certainly that sounds like the gap that you were looking to go to. The question that you asked is who's responsible for the consequence of AI influenced decision? And how did you come up with that question to start? And what was the overall feeling and vibe of your first symposium, given you're trying to bridge that gap? And certainly that question is something that helps to bridge that gap.
So I think the question it's one that I don't know many people who can easily answer this right now. And so I feel like there's this clear need to start sorting through it ourselves rather than waiting for somebody to hand us an answer. This happened to be a great time to actually do a first session because it was the end of this Panathenaea conference we have here, which ended right as Posidonia began. And so Panathenaea is this very cool reimagining of the ancient Greek festival, and it converges tech, art, startup ecosystems to engage and sort of inspire each other. I wanted to use this opportunity to test the format, especially as it also attracts investors and principals from other industries. And I think the more opportunities we have to engage with innovation in other sectors, the better, kind of in my opinion. Given the nature of Posidonia at the beginning of the marathon, which is when we did this, of the launch, the fact that when time is everyone's scarcest resource, the fact that we had a full house of commercial shipping operators was all the proof I needed that the appetite is real. One thing that went over really well was this changing some of the mental models that we hold around how we look at AI. So two reframes that I've worked out that I think are really helpful to start with are looking at AI as a strategic hire and not as a tool, and that as hiring managers should be the domain owner, and this is a person who takes on the responsibility. Because when you call AI a tool, you carry all sorts of assumptions around how tools behave. They do the same thing every time, fail visibly when they break. Tools suggest a static, predictable thing, and it doesn't suit a system that's probabilistic, context sensitive, can degrade silently, like all this stuff. So if you take a moment, this frame, and you think about why do you hire somebody in the first place? You want something done better than it's currently being done. This is also why we want AI. And a hire has a defined scope of authority. They get onboarded into a specific workflow. Trust is earned through results, and only confidence in them increases access. Someone remains accountable for what they're producing the entire time. This is also a good idea for AI, because if you look at AI as a hire, it closes the accountability gap that we have, and we keep stepping around. If AI is a tool, nobody is responsible for its behavior over time, because tools don't have behavior over time. And so this is where the management role will start to get super interesting, is because now we have this new strange team member that can be insanely capable, sometimes incredible, and other times truth shaped, and it may sound just as confident either way. How do you socialize it in a team? What does a performance review look like? How do you fire an AI? So I think these are the questions that the domain owner has to be able to answer, to be able to monitor the calls and intervene when something is off, and own what happens when they're either wrong or when the AI is wrong. Bringing that into a room where these are frameworks that people are used to dealing with on a daily basis. They know what it's like to hire a person. They know what it's like to monitor them and fire them and have expectations and all of these things. And so it becomes something that feels a lot more familiar, right? Rather than like we're talking about this foreign exotic creature that's in a very distant reality than the one that we're used to living.
We see this challenge often in shipping, and that is change management. And we'll get to that in a second. But was there anything that was a surprise when you had this symposium that kind of came out of it? Maybe it was the willingness of just having this many participants in a room at one time to talk about this. Again, as you said, when everybody's most precious commodity was time. Was there a topic or something that came out of it that was a little bit closer to that aha moment of shaping the discussion?
Yeah, there were a few. Just to start, the fact that we were fortunate to have the auspices of the Hellenic Chamber of Shipping, and that the chamber's president came, and Kostis Fragoulis, who's the president of the International Propeller Club, and Akis Tergakis, and the CEO of Stellar V Corp, right? It was great that they came for opening remarks, but what surprised me, and of course delighted me, was that all three of them chose to stay well into the discussion, despite all of the things competing for their time during the very beginning of Posidonia. And I think one of the main reasons is because people they actually like the discomfort that friction provides. The room was shocked at times, and I think this was usefully shocked, because it allowed for strong, uncensored positions. There was nobody there to please, and people had to decide in real time what they thought and how much of that hand they wanted to show. I'll give you one example. One of my partners at Further Ventures, Mike Constantinidis, he said in this very blunt way that the role of the software developer is over. He's like, sorry, don't shoot the messenger. Job is finished. All part of the disruption. Moving on, sort of thing. And so immediately, like, someone's hand shot up, and they said, well, I just hired a bunch of software developers, so maybe we should have a chat after this so I can figure out how many of them to keep. There was humor in it in the way that he said it, but you knew he was serious, of course. Lots of people went on to loudly disagree with this, and including me, because, I mean, I was a little bit more quiet about it. But I actually think there's going to be a whole emerging field for software developers cleaning up vibe-coded disasters, for one. If he'd sat there, meandered through all the nuances of survival, he would have spent a lot of time saying something that no one paid attention to. And so I think that's kind of the value of the think tank, because maritime leadership and leadership in general, they don't tend to pre-negotiate their conviction before they speak or try to temper intense reactions. That's what they respond to. That's when they sit up and pay attention and engage. And so afterwards, throughout the week of Posidonia, I had people coming up to me and being like, what happened in there? They had this energy, like they were ready to have a go right then and there, like flash mob style. If I had corralled a few people and been willing to do it, and ultimately asking when we would do another one.
One of the things that you touched upon earlier was just kind of change management. And this has been one of the themes in digitalization that I've seen really since I've done the podcast. Obviously, change management is a practice that goes back decades. I remember dealing with change management when I had to introduce ISO, ISM, when I was working in the mobile US flagged fleet. I was part of the team that introduced that. And that was just change management in a different costume, so to speak. And change management always has an element of the human side. In your discussions, whether it was leading up to your symposium or after it immediately at Posidonia and then beyond. I'd love to hear where the human element stayed in part on the shore side folks who have to implement these, think about these tools and the impact certainly on AI. And then was there any discussion or what did the discussion look like around the seafarers and the folks at sea who are going to be not necessarily part of the conversation, but certainly at the end of the conversation, being asked to do things that may or may not be AI enabled. Certainly, some of the decisions that they will be impacted by could be AI enabled, or at least at the end of the day, there was an AI gathering facts or part of that process. So I'd love to hear what the room, not only what the room had to say, but then what you had on the subsequent add-on conversations.
One way that we're seeing AI can have a profound impact on how we approach change management is because it finally makes the one-on-one tutor affordable and accessible, right? So we don't have to wait for someone else to make whatever technology makes sense to you increasingly. And you can actually change manage yourself because the system can now distill its complexity into these familiar concepts in the way you need it and based on what your role requires, if you're so inclined. And so I think part of what the conversation opened up was how do we make space for that inclination? How do we increase that motivation? How do we allow for this to be a priority that people can move towards rather than just something that seems like that it's still like a nice to have. We know that one of the main reasons that AI pilots fail is because people don't know how to use them or they don't want to. And so they quietly sabotage them. And so I think without change management on someone to champion why this is being brought in or the space to be able to feel like you can be self-motivated enough and have access to do this. You draw your own conclusions that you could be engineering your own replacement, right? When I think about all the different types of people in the industry that need to have change management tailored to what they're offering, this is part of what we're building out in the membership model. Even if you couldn't attend a session, the intelligence gets distilled there. And you can actually personalize how you engage with it. You can access through voice, chats, make podcasts, explainer videos, and all of this will be tailored to role and your level as to where you are when you start accessing it. And then this could grow over time because we have this intention to add in more adaptive learning features so that it can better track how you learn and think and in relation to the decisions and risks and responsibilities that you actually carry. I think as the nature of roles will continue to change. So for domain owners, like this can help with the decisions that they're specifically accountable, making the relevant material easiest to study in their preferred way. For others who are thinking about different paths, maybe becoming a domain owner or taking into account, where am I strongest? And how might that map onto other opportunities as new roles are added into the industry? So I think it gives you this agility and flexibility to have agency in everything that's going on. Agency is increasingly a core part of change management because otherwise it just feels like something is being done to you rather than it being a part of the experience that you're having in your the expertise that you're bringing to it.
Is that really the direction of where you're going with the think tank part of it? Is that going to be more of a think tank to manage change management? You had a successful start and you've gotten these discussions going, which are important for the industry. What is your next step in that? Is it another symposium? Is it building out? I'm really kind of curious as this kind of lives within the space, but in a unique area, because like I said, we haven't seen a lot of this. We see obviously venture studios, we've seen PE, we've seen private people investing in the industry, but that's more on the investment side. You're kind of putting almost a safe space to exchange ideas. Where is the next step and what are you thinking about for future gathering?
So we want to execute several live sessions over a year, maybe five or six. On the back of that, have the membership model built out so that you can take the intelligence as it's synthesized and what the room produces. And we have a framework that we're going to kind of synthesize it under so that it kind of always appears in the same shape. And then give you kind of the opportunity to spar with it. So you have this opportunity on the other side to continue to engage with the information and build this strength, build this digital fluency for yourself in whatever way works best for you. When you think about any individual journey that we have of our own experimentation, we need this kind of place that we can go where it's free from an audience or anyone passing judgment on what we didn't understand or what we didn't know. And so you will have this opportunity to just continue to ask it to explain something to you in a different way. And I have this idea that you might actually have to argue your point against, so you can argue against those types of people. And so you kind of practice this sort of art of negotiation while building your own strength and fluency in the privacy of your office or your own home or the bus or wherever you happen to be. It'll help you in every area that you're encountering the need to check how you're making a decision, why you're saying yes and no to things.
So really, it looks like almost developing an agent specifically tailored for change management. It sounds like what you're eventually at some point getting towards. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I love this idea. This idea of like change managing ourselves, right? Because that's kind of the role we're moving into. If you think about now, you can use AI as a personal tutor for almost anything. And you can choose how you learn. You just have to be kind of inclined to want to do that and kind of get comfortable with what that's like. But once you do, I mean, it can give you the information that you need to absorb in the way that you will best absorb it. That's an incredible strength, because when we look at what's happening with change management right now, it's very difficult to lead people through things that you're figuring out yourself at the moment, right? I mean, how do you provide this sort of stability and comfort when you don't have those answers, when you don't have that fluency yourself? The big obstacle that we have when we look for others to guide their teams through change management at the moment.
And then as I look to that, as you start to look to more of the future, what do you see in terms of the next generation of folks coming into maritime? There is the traditional path, which, even though it's not a familial story to me in terms of being a family-based one, my path, at least for a lot of people here in the US and other places, is pretty normal. Went to one of the maritime schools, sailed a little bit, and then you kind of go on your way. But folks like yourself who mid-career maybe comes into a really interesting area, has an interesting opportunity, what do you think the skills are going to be needed for them? And then ultimately, maybe folks like myself who are, I'm talking age-wise, who need to be in leadership roles that they're going to need, again, who are already established, but now need to lead these folks coming in who have different skill sets and playing, as you just mentioned, on a ground that is shifting.
So my feeling is that we're headed toward a soft skills renaissance, though I really want to rebrand soft skills because I don't even like saying it. I think it needs another name. So I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, Vasilis Moyis, who's the director of Doric Shipbrokers. He's also part of our first panel. And we were discussing what the shipbroker of the future would look like when there are fewer of them. The characteristics that we agreed on, and I think this is going to map onto so many other roles, which is why I think it's a useful example here, is that immediately we said high emotional intelligence, good listeners, eye contact, no FOMO when you're in a conversation with them, not scanning the room, not fiddling with the phone, generalists with enough knowledge across areas a conversation might touch so that you're welcome company and you can keep it going wherever it leads. Good at reading body language and catching small tells, and all of these things that I think maybe are, some people think, oh, it's nice to have, not essential, will matter more and more as a way of establishing trust as technology continues to seep into all of our interactions. The fact that there's a question if they have any real payoff will no longer exist, I think. If AI can take some of the weight away from what has caused some of these skills to be currently in decline, I think we will create the conditions for these instincts to come back optimistically. I'm thinking optimistically. I also think the next generation is going to need to be comfortable challenging machines as well as humans. Part of this, I think, ties back to what we were saying about being self-motivated to teach yourself things that you want to learn. This is going to be increasingly important in order to be future-proof. And also, I think it will be a new established point of credibility, because at the moment, people that you look to for expertise in AI, most of them are self-taught. They figured it out for themselves. They had to. There was no one to teach them. And so, I feel like lifelong learning here becomes something of a love language. It's now going to be a survival skill.
I tend to agree on that. Certainly on what was branded on the soft skills. It was so easy to at one time to just say you need to be an engineer, you need to do this, you need your MBA and all these things. And it's like, yeah, those things definitely help. I ultimately think, and you kind of get to it a little bit as well, that in whatever industry that you're in, being a domain expert is going to be a very valued and valuable asset that a person has, understanding how the domain works. And I look at maritime and people say, well, you understand maritime. I'm like, well, no, I understand a sliver of maritime. You talk to me about things like marine insurance. No, thank you. You talk to me about container ships. Yeah, I drive by them on 95, and that's the extent of my relationship. And I think that there is certainly in maritime that where you could have somebody come in, become a domain expert over time, fielding phone calls from agents or dealing with the ships when they have an issue aboard or whatever the case is, design, whatever that is, and you build up your own credibility. And I think that that's where the real extra value is. And I think that that AI can't replace it. Again, I think it's going to be a matter of replacing a lot of the rote tasks that people did, like data entry or having to transpose a spreadsheet because it always comes in a weird way. I think those things will be settled pretty quickly by AI and allowing people, especially in our industry, to make critical and key decisions. And, this has been really interesting because we're talking about change management, and I love talking about that. And you're positioning what you're trying to do with further in that domain. Where do you see what you're doing in a year? Where do you see the real impact? A year from now, 2 years from now, we're having this conversation. What do you hope to achieve?
I would love for further ventures to be one of the places that the industry goes willingly and with enthusiasm, if I dare to dream, to do some of this lifelong learning in relationship to technology. Maritime has traditionally been this yes, but industry of exceptions, right? What about this thing over here? And this kind of pops up whenever somebody tries to write a playbook for digitalization and adoption. And now AI gives us this opportunity to log all those exceptions so we don't forget them and to organize them so you can go back and find things and map out maybe not where we're repeating mistakes or history, but in rhyme. So how do we work through this before? What might it correspond to? I think our sessions are where those yes buts get vocalized and every synthesis can log them. So 1 is a useful moment, 10 can start to reveal some patterns, and 20 over several years becomes a longitudinal record of how our industry navigated one of the biggest technological shifts. So how we manage transitions like building the data literacy to finally make the better decisions we've been told AI will help us make. And this isn't something that can be reconstructed later because you can't go back and capture how people thought before they knew. The think tank at its best will not just be an archive of what the industry learned, but how it learned it.
I think that that's really important. I'm really curious to see the evolution here, certainly from 2 points of view. One, the impact. I think the thing that you're going to run into is, of course, the industry is A, as I mentioned before, very siloed, and B, not only are they siloed within the industry, but certainly within a lot of verticals within the same company. Operations doesn't tell chartering what's going on. I've been there. I've seen that. Technical management is kind of its own silo, purchasing, so on. So I'm curious to see how that evolves. And then the other thing is just there's always this issue about sharing data and am I losing my competitive advantage? And I think that that's going to be something that this industry, like many others, struggles with. We're not unique in that, but it's finding that sweet spot of data that we can share that still allows us to keep competitive advantage. Certainly now where the AI can do a lot of insights where they weren't possible or easily possible for before. And that becomes something that a lot of companies are looking at is data moating. So trying to moat their data so that it stays useful for the people who either pay for it or who access to it or you own it versus the industry as a whole. So I think we're going to be looking at a lot of those things and hopefully looking to you to at least not provide answers, but maybe a nice forum that we could look at. As I close, I always love to ask what people are reading and what is on your nightstand or in your backpack as you're traveling to meet with different people as you start to build out this next part of further.
So I'm currently reading John Steinbeck's The Log from the Sea of Cortez, which I'm long overdue to read. It was just given to me, and so I've only just started it. The introduction alone has convinced me it's the right book at the right time. Technically, it's this log of 6 weeks in 1940 when Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts took the sardine boat down the Gulf of California to collect from the tide pools. But I think more it's how the two of them thought together, and how their narrative intermingles the animals and the arguments, and quote unquote bright with sun and wet with seawater, the whole crusted over exploring thought. I mean, yeah, I just wrote that down because I loved it. And they apparently had this game on the boat that they called speculative metaphysics. And so what they would do is they'd take one thing they observed that day and see how far they could think from it, just for the pleasure of watching where it went. Steinbeck always said that they worked so closely that he rarely remembered who started which line of speculation, and that at the end it's a product of both minds in the process. So you might say I can recognize the game.
That's pretty interesting. And you'd be happy to know, I think the first person of 140 plus episodes to bring up Steinbeck, or even one of the more modern American masters that we have here. Although I don't know if that's 100% true. I think that's mostly true. Anyway, Emma, great. Thank you so much for coming on. This was a really enlightening conversation, because I think that we've had folks come on from venture studios and PE, and then big companies that invest in maritime, be it from the ship owner side or cargo owner side, but really to kind of get to the point where things are starting to understand how it's getting synthesized and understand how we could keep pushing forward and maybe not engaging some of these roadblocks that we've seen in the past. So Emma, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Chris. It was a real pleasure.